What's up, everybody? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricky Varandas. Today we got author and journalist Russ Baker. He's also the editor and creator of whowhatwhy.org, a great website where you can get just up-to-date news on historical events and current events. So definitely check that out. Russ Baker's written for everybody: New Yorker, Vanity Fair, New York Times, The Nation, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Village Voice, Esquire, Salon, just to name a few. And he's written for other publications overseas. But he's just a really knowledgeable, smart guy who's been doing this for a long time. Always a pleasure to talk to him. So definitely enjoy the show. In the beginning of the show, I was going to cut it out, but you know what? I'll leave it in. The whole point of this show, or not the whole point, but one of the points of this show is to share some interesting information that could be useful. And we have a little bit of small talk about how to help with your stomach bug, because Russ had one at the moment. So you know what? That information could be helpful to somebody too. So why cut that out when somebody might have a stomach bug? Listen to this podcast and it could help them out. So I'll leave that in. And also, we talk about the Boston bombing. We talk about a little bit of the Bush family and the upcoming election. We talk about a whole bunch of stuff that I obviously can't remember at the moment. But it was a long podcast. It was an hour and 20 minutes or something like that. So enjoyed. It was a great time. It's always really fun to talk to Russ. And like I tell him at the beginning of the show, every time I listen to him speak or hear an interview with him, I always end up learning something. Also, check out his podcast. Who What Why has a podcast, which you can find just like the Ripple Effect podcast. You can find it on every podcast app. It doesn't matter if it's an Android or iPhone or whatnot. So definitely look that up. And they also upload Who What Why specific podcasts. So podcasts that are created from by whowhatwhy.org, but also they upload other interviews that Russ Baker has done. So if you're a fan of Russ Baker, it's a great place to just get interviews or hear interviews with him. So definitely check that out. Also, let me just remind you guys, check out our YouTube channel, and underneath the show descriptions, you'll always find the links to our guests' websites, their Facebook, Twitters, all that stuff. I make it easy for you guys to find more of their work if you're interested in it. Also, you can find my Theory 6 music project link. So if you guys want to support the show, you can get Theory 6 music anywhere you can get downloadable music, and that money goes right to supporting the show and the music project. So also on the YouTube channel, if you want to subscribe to it, you can also find the video versions of our episodes. Last time Russ was on, we did a video conversation, so you could actually see us have the conversation. This time we did just audio, but anytime I do a video conversation with a guest, you can actually go on our YouTube channel and find the video version of the episode and us talking, and you can visually see who I'm talking to in case you want to put a face to the opinion. So thanks again, guys. I'm going to try to get the show out as soon as possible. Like my listeners know by now, I'm just like everybody else listening to the show. I have a full-time job and priorities and a kid and all this stuff. So very busy life, and it's hard to get these out as soon as I'd like, but I'm going to do my best to try to get this thing out within the next couple days, because I know the last one kind of took a little bit of time. So I'll get right to it, and I'll talk to you on the next one. Peace. Hey, what's up?
How you doing?
So you have a little bit of a stomach bug?
Yeah, I don't know. Just probably something I ate, the usual.
I'll tell you, I'll give you a little tip. One thing that helps is, I don't know if you're familiar with active charcoal, but I've had an issue with food poisoning. I've for some reason, once you get it once, it just has, apparently the bacteria never really dies, and you're more likely to get it again.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I have a buddy who owns a vitamin store, and he's kind of like my doctor on call, because I'm a big fan of like natural remedies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And he told me about this stuff called active charcoal. So I'm like, I'll give it a try. Why not? And immediately after I took it's basically just charcoal in a pill. And I guess that's where the saying comes from. I guess there's this old wise tale that if you take or if you eat burnt toast, and it helps with calming your stomach. And,
Oh, right.
Yeah, have you heard that?
Yeah, sure.
Well, that's where it comes from. It's the charcoal that it actually creates when burning it that actually helps calm your stomach, and the charcoal will actually kill the bacteria. So I always have a little bit of active charcoal at home. I always keep a bottle of it just in case.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because actually activated charcoal, like it what it does is it's if you take like a lump of charcoal, it's extremely absorbent, and so I'm guessing, I don't know if it kills the stuff or it just absorbs it, but whatever it does, I guess that would make sense.
Yeah, that's so that's a little trick, which is a better option than what I used to do, was go to the hospital and then just get information about staying hydrated. Well, thanks again, Russ. I really appreciate you coming back on the show. And last time you were on, you're just a wealth of information. I subscribe to your podcast app. Well, not the podcast app, the podcast itself, the Who What Why podcast. And I know that you're always uploading your own podcast from your website and also other interviews you do. And it's amazing every time I hear you speak. Anytime you do an interview, it's amazing the amount of information you stored throughout these years and hold. And I just, thanks again. I really appreciate it. I'm sure myself and the listeners are going to learn some stuff today.
Well, happy to do it.
And so let's start off with something that happened not too long ago. I know you were covering the Boston bombings, and it's funny how emotional people get when we talk about that topic, because it seems like a lot of times, because I'd be paying attention to the work you're doing on the Who What Why website, and I would bring up some of the questions you guys would bring up when I was with friends and when the trial was going on, and it's amazing how quickly people just jump to basically just saying you're crazy, it's obvious, it's cut and dry, what happened, those guys are terrorists. There's pictures of them with the ISIS like style flag. There's they obviously did it and all this stuff. And did you see kind of or did you have similar issues with like trying to, I guess, question some of these stories? Like people were looking at you like, why are you questioning this? Do you think it was an emotional thing, or what do you think it was?
Yeah, I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I can certainly say that when powerful emotional events take place, and it can be tremendous happiness or sadness or terror or any of these things, our minds are not running our body. The chemicals are. And the manipulation of human beings via a whole bunch of different stimuli, visual, oral, all of these different kinds of things, they create an automatic response. And this has been understood by those who sought to rule other people throughout history. If you go all the way back, there were, even in ancient times, there were methods to do that. And if you think about the waving the red flag in front of the bull, it's really something like that. And I think we all know that when we get, let's say, for example, really, really mad about something, we're no longer rational. And these kinds of events, there is a need on the part of each of us as individuals to reconcile and settle the discomfiture and the terror. We need certainty and we need closure. And this is not even a choice. So it's not something we're choosing to do. So our tendency when anything alarming happens is to take the simplest explanation from those who say that they will protect us. And so when someone else comes along and says, now hold on for a second, how do we know we're actually safe? How do we know it's been solved or settled? How do we know that there is not more to it? The instant reaction is anger at the messenger, so-called kill the messenger. And I think that's what we see in these things. As a member of the media, I've experienced it personally with major events like 9/11, anything like that. The second something happens, I'm sure it was the same thing with Pearl Harbor, there is an understanding that we all need to close ranks. And I understand that too. It makes sense that in Hurricane Katrina, an emergency, you want to close ranks and everybody dig in and help. But in these kinds of instances, like the Boston bombing, there is nothing for us to do, actually. And yet we still feel this need to get out there, plant flags, participate in memorial services. So we need that. We need that kind of catharsis. And so along comes this stinker who says, well, there's some things that don't really add up. And so we lash out at them. We label them kooks or something. We don't really even want to hear whether we ought to question the authorities. And yet, watch the Republican debates. It's all about how you can't trust Washington.
Yeah, it is pretty funny how that works. There's a great, I actually just had somebody from the film company Free Mind Films, and they did a great documentary called State of Mind: The Psychology of Control, and it's a great historical movie on, like you said, those in power, and they understand the psychology of how to keep people making emotional decisions and kind of this herd type thinking of keeping people going along with the group, and it really is a method that's been used for generations, and like you said, it happened after September 11th. I remember reading polls about how many people thought that Iraq and Saddam had something to do with September 11th after September 11th, because they just kept relating the two words. They kept saying September 11th, and in the same sentence or a sentence soon after, they would bring up Saddam and Iraq. So people were relating the two, and then I think it was like something like 80% of the U.S. thought that they had something to do with it, just because of probably, like you said, the emotional thing of everybody's worked up, everybody's very patriotic, everybody's upset, they feel like they have to do something. And like you said, when we think emotionally and not logically, that's when people can really take advantage of us. And the other thing you see is how people were clapping after they caught the younger brother, and it's like, you guys just had a police state in Boston, and everybody's clapping, like they're excited the fact that and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, I don't want to minimize all the people who lost limbs and everything that's happened, and obviously there's 3 deaths, and that's more than anybody wants to see, and but it was amazing how big of a story it was when really, I remember when it first happened, I'm like, 3 people died, and they're really like, it's literally seems like it was the next September 11th, like it was the next terrorist attack. And I don't know if that was on purpose or whatnot, but it kind of seemed like it. It seemed like they were, before they had all the information, they were kind of making us feel like it was a terrorist attack. Is that an accurate, I guess, memory of how the media was talking about the story?
Yeah, let me explain. Let me provide a comparison, if I may. James Holmes killed 12 people. As you were mentioning, 3 people died in the Boston Marathon bombing. He killed 12 people, and he wounded 70. Okay, now I don't know what the stats are in terms of dismemberment and things like that, but I think if you compared the two, you could probably show that James Holmes caused more damage. As he certainly killed 4 times as many people, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Now, Johar Tsarnaev, who was the younger brother of the person who is presented as the perpetrator, has been sentenced to death. So right away you have to say, why is this one getting death and the other getting life in prison? Now you can talk about the jurisdiction and the state of mind of the political atmosphere in each of these places and so on. But the fact is, Massachusetts is supposedly a sort of a liberal state, I think more so than Colorado, and yet a harsher sentence. And that raises the question, why? And then the answer is, it's because there was a need for that kind of closure, which raises the question, why? And I think you're absolutely correct. Look, we know that the leadership in the United States has fabricated wars and justifications for wars. This is not even in dispute. And you brought up the example of falsely trying to conflate stuff with Saddam Hussein. On our website, Who, What, Why, we were among, really, as far as I know, the only news organization to question the U.S. invasion of Libya and the reasons, and a lot of the stuff that we have heard about Gaddafi, which turns out, listen, I'm not defending the man, but turns out to have been grossly exaggerated, much of it even made up. And this is what you do. I think any thinking person realizes that when they want to convince somebody of something so that they can get some advantage, they will say whatever they can get away with. in order to convince the person and gain that advantage. They only stop when the person challenges them. And I mean, Donald Trump is a perfect example of this. He's a man who has essentially lied throughout his career, and yet there he is up there lecturing us about being honest and open. So we don't seem to have any standards for any of this stuff. And certainly, I'm happy to talk about the Boston bombing and a whole bunch of these things and how they do fit in to the expansion of the security state and the loss of our own civil liberties and other rights.
Well, yeah, because the funny thing is that when they caught them, or I think in the process of catching them or looking for them in Boston, because I'm from Massachusetts, so I know how big of a story it was. And when they were looking for him, it was my birthday's April 19th, so I know they caught him or they were looking for him sometime around that time. And we're at a bar celebrating my birthday with a couple of friends, and one of my good friends who's a police officer is like, they shut down the whole city, but usually and he's a detective, he's like, your best help to catch somebody is the public, their eyes and ears, the tips you get. And of course, soon after, they open up or they get rid of the police state, they let people leave their homes, and somebody spots him and they catch him, and he was right. And so this whole idea of like shutting down a whole city for, like you said, 3 people, and I'm glad you made that James Holmes comparison, because that's something I just recently in the news, and I never even put the 2 and 2 together, that you're absolutely right. He killed many more people. He got life in prison, and this guy's going to get, possibly the death penalty. So it's amazing how they justify it. And like you said, historically, they've always used these type of things to justify losing our freedoms and securities, and it gets to a point where it's just like, when are we basically contradicting our whole purpose of we're trying to protect ourselves, but really, I mean, I'm not sure I guess my point is the Boston bombing happened even though they kept taking away securities and freedoms and stuff like that to try to make us safer, and things like that continue to happen. You're not going to stop that, so what's the point of taking away everybody's freedoms? So when you were looking into the Boston bombing, what was the part of the story that made the least sense, or the part where was there a giant hole that you're like, okay, something about this doesn't necessarily make sense?
Well, I mean, I have to say that as an investigative journalist, I rely a lot on a kind of a sixth sense about things, and that is not just really an imaginary thing. It comes from experience. You've seen enough things, you've read enough things, and you see patterns. And right when the bombing happened, I actually got a bad feeling beyond just the bad feeling you get from the bombing itself. I immediately thought of the symbolism of it. The Boston Marathon, Patriots Day, tax day, it all happened. All these factors came together, and then a bomb went off. And so my first thought was, whoever's behind or whatever's behind this, they either lucked out or they were aware of the tremendous sort of trifecta of symbolism. And so that struck me. And that's just, I think, a rational way of looking at something as soon as it happens, that you could say that these people were aware of the symbolism there, as opposed to planting a bomb in a shopping center in Omaha on some random Saturday. I mean, there's a big difference. So that struck me right away, and I wanted to know, therefore, what that symbolism was about. Now, if you think about it, we are told this is Islamic terrorism, and yet the first thing that occurred to me was, well, what do Islamic terrorists do? Well, number one, they become martyrs. So they don't fear death. They cause death in others, and then they basically they themselves die. So that didn't happen here. Nobody that we know of, no perpetrator died directly after this dramatic event. The second thing I thought of is that what they always do is they're looking for the symbolism, and they're looking to make a political statement. That's almost always the case. I mean, Charlie Hebdo and so on. What was the political statement they made here? There was none. There was no political statement made. These people who, and I'm going to still use the term alleged because I believe a lot has not come out yet. But in any case, these people found, the older brother was not tried, but so I'll use the term alleged. But anyway, these alleged perpetrators were at the marathon bombing. We know that from video. And we know that they then went on with their lives like everybody else at the thing who was not injured. The older brother went back to his wife and kid in Cambridge, and the younger brother went back to his college dorm. They even stopped to buy milk. Right after it, in fact, they not only bought milk, but then the younger brother came back into the store to exchange it for another milk. Very, very odd. Not the normal behavior of Islamic fundamentalists. But the key point is they never claimed credit for this, and they didn't act in any way, shape, or form like the prototypical Islamic fundamentalist terrorist. And so it doesn't fit. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the FBI put up pictures of these two guys shown wearing backpacks, and they said these are subjects of interest. Does anyone know who they are? So my first thought is, why are they subjects of interest? What is it about two young guys wearing backpacks in a video at a public event with presumably hundreds, if not thousands, of people with backpacks? So I didn't get why they thought they were of interest. Now, the third thing was that within days of that, a report came out in the Russian media, some sort of a leak from the Russian security forces, that the Russians knew who these brothers were, and furthermore that the Russians had previously notified the Americans of these people prior to the bombings. And then the FBI was forced to admit that they had hid that fact or forgotten that, which is really preposterous. And they were forced to admit that, yes, the Russians had told them, and that, in fact, yes, they had checked them out as possible terrorists, and that they had interacted with the elder brother and the family and concluded that he was no threat. Now, how is that not front and center of what we're talking about in this case? Because even in the best case scenario, it means that the FBI is no good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. How do they, I have the same friend that's a police officer. I brought that up to him, and he did say that sometimes you investigate something and then you see nothing there, and then you move on, and then it's possible that something could happen afterwards. They could become extremists or whatnot afterwards. I guess that is one-sided.
Well, of course, but you can't just have outfits like the FBI with the power and the money and everything they have and just let them off like that. We're not talking about a child who spilled something. Yeah. This is an outfit, as you point out, they were able to shut down an entire American city and suspend our civil liberties, and that your cop friend is not even slightly curious, or that there are no consequences or no investigations or no recriminations or no heads roll, that your cop friend it doesn't even occur to him that maybe if somebody, pardon my French, screws up that big, that there ought to be some kind of result to that there ought to be some kind of investigation and something ought to be fixed. The fact that these people are so clueless as to not even understand that, if you discover that the babysitter is a pedophile, you don't go, well, okay, whatever. You don't, and you should not do that in an instance like this. So that's just baloney. And at our website, Who, What, Why, we have done almost 80 articles about the Boston Marathon bombing. That's about 80 more investigative pieces than any of your news organizations, including the Boston Globe or anybody else. There was no serious attempt to investigate the holes in the story. They could have done a 10-part series just on how the FBI screwed up, how it happened, who screwed up, why, what changes they have made, whether there were any kind of punishment meted out against the people responsible. Why was there none of that? Why was there no discussion? Why was there no investigation? Now, the third thing on that front, or I don't know, I've lost count, is that it turns out that the FBI was in contact with Tamerlan Tsarnaev before the Russians tipped them off. Before. Now, we are the only people to report this. Again, if you go to whowhatwhy.org and you go in our search box and put in Tsarnaev, Tsarnaev, and you'll get a lot of articles, but somewhere in there you'll find articles on that particular point. The FBI had a prior relationship with the elder brother. Now, once you know that, and you're not willing, and you see how nobody was punished, you start saying, well, if nobody was punished for either gross incompetency or something else, and there was a secret prior relationship with the brother, don't you think we ought to wonder if we're missing something here?
Yeah, yeah. And there's that video. I don't know what your conclusion is or what your opinion is on that video of that nude person being arrested that looked a lot like the older brother. But have you? I don't know if that was him but it certainly did look like him. And the build, he's kind of built like him, like an athlete boxer. And what do you think happened to the older brother? Obviously, there's conflicting stories with the brother ran him over or the cops ran him over after, the trial and all the investigation and information you gathered. What do you think happened?
Well, I mean, we published an article fairly early on discussing the fact that the FBI routinely recruits foreign nationals, which is what the elder brother was, and put them into play as informants and provocateurs. This is a standard operating procedure. And even the New York Times, which didn't have the guts to investigate this thing, did publish a piece pointing out that out of 22 plots, 18 of them involved people being run by the FBI. Now, hello. So, I mean, to not be interested in that, I mean, I really despair for this country. And I despair for the media. I despair for the so-called intellectual elites, because either we're like the stupidest people on earth or there's something else going on, because the fact that the kind of things that we've uncovered are not of interest to people and they continue to wave their flags and cheer. I mean, my God, we have no right to call ourselves, talk about American exceptionalism and talk about how, strut around and how superior we are and these pathetic, immigrants who want to come here. I mean, honestly, this is just a complete and total abdication of common sense and of everything else. And so when I look at that story, I mean, there is a very high probability that if, as we know, the FBI had prior contact with Tamerlan Tsarnaev, that they did not simply go talk to him and ask him if he was a terrorist, which is what they claim. There's another article on our site, whowhatwhy.org, you can read. It was a special report by the inspectors general of a bunch of the major intelligence agencies. Now, that's not normal that they do this interagency report. That itself was special. When the report came out, it got very little attention, even though it was such a singular event. Much of what was in there was blacked out, so we can't even read it. And even what they didn't black out showed these inspectors general of these agencies themselves complaining that they were being stonewalled and prevented from knowing what was really going on. They ended up doing a whitewash because they had to, but they made very, very clear, and you didn't have to read too much between the lines, that they could see that there was a cover-up going on and they were being blocked. And so it seems to me that an open-minded, serious person, given the track record of the FBI in general, the pattern of recruiting infiltrators and provocateurs, the fact of the documented FBI prior relationship with Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and then we add some other things. Tamerlan Tsarnaev was no sign of him being a radical. He was married to a blonde non-Muslim, although we are told she converted. I mean, he didn't fit the profile in any which way. We do know that around the time that he began to appear to be a radical, he was seeking to enter the Golden Gloves competition. He was a very gifted boxer, but he was told that to represent the United States in competitions, he had to be an American citizen. And so right at the moment that he needed to impress the American authorities with his patriotism, which is what that process is about, he begins acting like a radical Muslim and doing clumsy things and going into mosques and kind of yelling and seemingly provoking people. Now, it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together there.
Yeah, and see, you're hitting on a really, really important issue, and that's motive. You talk to any detective, you talk to any investigator. I mean, motive is one of the biggest things you look into, and the fact that a lot of these cases, the motive is still unclear. You know, it's not like you said, extreme radical who makes his motive very clear. You know, either a Confederate flag guy or a extreme Muslim who, like you said, blows himself up, and he thinks he's going to heaven and all these things. I mean, it's just, it doesn't seem like the typical extreme thinking extremist who has a clear motive and makes it obvious to the world. And I mean, it just seems kind of, it kind of seems like Jack Ruby, like Jack Ruby. Oh, he killed Oswald because he was, patriotic all of a sudden. I mean, this guy was a mobster who obviously didn't give a shit about politics. So it just seemed like one of those things where you're looking into motive, which I think is a really important point. And I think a lot of times we just kind of put that aside and kind of create our own motive. And I just think that that's something that we should look more into, because to do something as extreme as building bombs and killing 3 people, injuring many more, you would think that they were quite extreme, and it would be quite clear that they're quite extreme. And like you said, it doesn't seem like the picture all fits together correctly. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I know you looked into, his name's not really Danny, but the Danny video, the kid who ran away at the gas station, and I've seen that video and stuff. And what's your conclusion to that? And for people who haven't heard about that whole situation and kind of the holes in that story, could you expand on that?
Sure, and just want to wrap up on the point you were making about motive. We could talk for an hour just about motive, but there's also, as you know, there's motive, means, and opportunity. And I want to talk for a second about means, because after the bombs went off, and that week, the experts declared that the bombs were very sophisticated. And even after one brother was dead and one was apprehended, we were told that they lacked the capability to manufacture those bombs, that they were not qualified to do that. We also know that the authorities never discovered where the bombs were made. They were, they went over their homes with a fine-tooth comb, and they did not feel that the bombs had been made there. So the question is, if they didn't have the capability to make the bombs were not made on their premises, then what are we missing here? So I just want to raise that there are literally probably 50 or 100 significant points like that we could talk about. But to move on to your other point. Most of us don't even remember why we are. You earlier in the program talked about people who get angry at you because they say, we know that they did it. So I say to people, how do we know that? And they just look at me with astonishment. I was just up on Martha's Vineyard, and I ended up in a conversation with a very, very famous, nationally famous Boston lawyer. People can probably figure out who it is. And his son was there, a nice fellow. We started talking, and the son said, we know they did it. And I said, your father is a famous criminal defense lawyer, so how do we know they did it? And, he basically sort of stared at me and, kind of was like, well, the authorities told us they did it. I said, well, you grew up in a household where you're all about questioning whether people actually did it, So this is the groupthink. This is the mindset, and this is an intelligent guy. That I'm not picking on him, but my point is that's the best of the best, and it's all downhill from there. Now, as far as this Danny story, one of the reasons we think he did it is basically because they kept telling us that he did it, and there were leaks and calculated leaks, tremendous array of leaks up to the trial, so the public mind was basically set, and the pool from which the jurors were drawn, even though they insisted that could be fair, they had all already made up their mind, because you had to be living on the moon not to know that these guys did it. Because we were told that again and again. Now, one of the ways we were told that was that some events transpired shortly before one brother was killed and the other one supposedly escaped. And that was that a private police officer at MIT was shot. And then some hours later, we heard that that there had been a carjacking and it gradually came out right at the same time that there was this supposed gun battle with the brothers, that the carjacking victim had escaped from the car and had told police that he had been carjacked by a man who had identified himself as the Boston bomber, and he also announced that he had just shot an MIT cop. Now, I have to say that in my quarter century or more of covering crime and things like that, I'm not going to say there aren't people who brag about crimes, because there are some, but when people are in a panic and they are seeking to flee and they have a gun and they have already commandeered somebody with their car, they're not necessarily looking to give their hostage additional reasons to act irrationally or to panic them. All they wanted to do, really, if they did, and we're not even sure that story is correct, was to get out of the Boston area and get out with their lives, okay? And so here they already had their own car. Now, you can argue that they didn't want to use their own car because they were afraid that their plates had been made and so on. Okay, so they take another car. Now, they take this guy as a hostage because they don't want him running to the police. Fine. But then this guy announces, oh, and by the way, I'm wanted more than you could possibly imagine, and you are now famous. I mean, why would you do that? You wouldn't want the guy having any such thoughts. And so that didn't make any sense to me. And I began investigating this story. And it took me months and months and months of going back and forth to where I started seeing inconsistencies in the stories that this guy nicknamed Danny had told the media. I also was instantly fascinated that they were masking his identity. They were not saying who this witness was, and it wasn't clear why they were masking his identity, because in normal situations where the perpetrators have been brought to account and we were told there were no other Confederates, you don't have any reason to hide the person's identity. But they hid his identity, and B, they made him available for interviews with selected particular close friends of the security state within the media. And I mean, for example, John Miller of CBS, whose prior job had been as the chief spokesman of the FBI. And so these people, their entire careers are based on chummy relationships with a particular group of actors and cooperating with whatever they want you to do. And that's John Miller, that's some of these other people. They're the only ones who were allowed to interview this guy, and he had a handler. The Boston Globe supposedly found him on their own, and he had a handler. He had a professor of criminology who, for some inexplicable reason, was controlling interfaces with this young man. And I should tell you, I figured out who he was, and I tried to interview him, and I was blocked by this criminologist, who I find to be a very suspicious character, and if I may say so, and if he wants to take issue with me on that, then let him take issue with me. But I found him to be a very suspicious character. Northeastern University, where he teaches, has billions of dollars of contracts with the security state. There are literally, Ricky, hundreds and hundreds of things like what I'm telling you that are wrong with this Boston story, and the public knows basically none of them unless they routinely read Who, What, Why.
Are you talking about Jamie Foxx? Is that the guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and John Miller is also the guy who said that he wrote a confession. The younger brother wrote a confession on the boat, right? Was that ever, because that was another thing that if you get in a conversation with somebody, that's usually one of the things to get brought up pretty quickly, is that, well, he confessed, he wrote it on the boat.
Yeah, well, first of all, there are real questions as to exactly what happened, and who wrote what, and when it was discovered, and whether he wrote it, and what was written was in fact a confession. And again, I mean, we assembled a whole team at Who, What, Why, and some of them are experienced journalists, and some of them are just really smart, talented, young volunteer researchers, and we all dug into that. And again, as I said, at Who, What, Why, we did 80 articles, and in those articles, you could find 2 or 3 about that so-called confession. Our person who did that story, who knows the Quran and so on and so forth, concluded that was not a confession. that was the kind of thing that somebody might just write when they were bored and trapped somewhere, or feared for their life or something else. And so there are many, many issues about that so-called confession that we have not heard.
Yeah, and being from Massachusetts, the local radio stations, WEI, and a bunch of them were basically they had 24/7 talk about the Boston bombing and what was going on in an investigation. And I remember when they found him in the boat, they shot up that thing. I mean, it didn't seem like they were trying to let him out alive, because they didn't know if he was armed. I understand that, but I remember they were talking about they found him in a boat and all this, and then all of a sudden you just hear just gunshots like crazy, and I'm just like, wow, they're not. I mean, it just seemed like they weren't. At least they weren't concerned about him going to trial and him getting out alive.
Well, that's another thing that demands investigation. If we're not troubled by the fact that a person who had not been convicted or charged with anything yet, who was believed to be hiding somewhere, who had not fired a single shot, if we think it's okay for law enforcement to fire more than 100 shots at that person, I mean, we got something really wrong with ourselves. I would just say this: anybody listening to this program, try to imagine that your child or your sibling or your parent, somebody had claimed that they had done something, and they were in their workshop, or they were in a garden shed, or wherever they were, and the police showed up, and the police fired 100 shots into that unit. Do you want to tell me you're okay with that? You want to tell me you don't think there should be an investigation about whether these people really should be allowed to even have guns, or what kind of training do they have, or what kind of coordination goes on? The fact, again, as with these other things I mentioned, that there's nobody's held responsible for any of this. None of this is investigated or looked into. I mean, it just means that we, as a society, we have no standards and we don't care.
Yeah, but I did, in regard to go back to that gas station videotape, something that seemed kind of, I guess, it kind of made sense to me was the fact, or it didn't make sense to me, I should say, was the brother going into the gas station and casually shopping, and I don't know if did you watch that videotape of
absolutely, and I will agree with you that if the FBI and the whole world is hunting for you, okay, it is improbable. Number one, it's improbable that you're going to go into a convenience store brimming with people and cameras. Okay, number one, presumably they left their homes and they did all this stuff. If they were going to be on the road, they would have maybe, grabbed something or eaten something, but you're exposing yourself ridiculously by doing that. And as you point out, the guy shops for like several minutes, like he's thinking about does he want the potato chips with or without ruffles or whatever you call them, ridges. I mean, I'm sorry, I think any serious person looking at that and comparing that to other people who are fleeing would say this is not the normal behavior of a terrorist or of a person who is panicked and is on the run. So there's that. Now, there are other things at the gas station. On Who, What, Why, we ran a 2-part series on Danny, and I discovered that Danny told 3 different versions of his story. Now, this is very similar to the Lee Harvey Oswald thing, by the way, where there were multiple stories, and then finally the media and the government all settled on one narrative, and they kept repeating that one narrative until the public and everyone else just, stopped even being aware that there had been other explanations, and they were never forced to reconcile them. But basically, the narrative that nobody even remembers, practically, the Danny story, but those who do may remember that Danny said that the way he escaped was that the brothers needed gas, and they pulled into this gas station, and that one brother got out and went in to pay. For some reason, they couldn't pay at the pump, and then the other brother sat next to him, and that he was fiddling with the GPS and had put the gun down for a moment, and that this Danny bolted. That's the so-called official story. But we found another interview he gave earlier, I guess before his friend from Northeastern started steering him around, and he told a different story. And he said that one brother went inside to pay, and that the other brother was standing outside the car with the gas nozzle. Now, again, here are these murderous people, and they've carjacked a guy, and they leave him alone in the car. I mean, he could have started honking. He could have locked her. Who knows? I mean, there are so many issues with that. That's just not it's not the way you would think of as very motivated, calculating criminal types. And so that story was the first story he told, but it disappeared. By the way, there was another story he told somewhere where he basically indicated that nobody carjacked him at all, that they took his car, but that they just left him. He got out of his car and they took off. Now, if you wonder why a guy would tell three different stories and why one story would survive, it's obvious that the story that survived was the best story, because the other stories, if he was asked about that, or those stories were to survive, they would not paint the picture that needed to be painted of these brothers.
Yeah, but the thing about the gas station is that the casualty shopping didn't make sense. But if I remember it correctly, didn't Danny get out of the car or vehicle or SUV, whatever it was, ran away, and then the other brother came to the door at the gas station of the convenience store and said something to him. Then he put all the things that he had, basically that he was going to buy, put it down, and then ran out. Didn't that kind of seem consistent with, I guess, somebody who carjacked somebody?
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm going to give you something completely fanciful, let's say, and theoretical. But as I say, I've covered so many of these things, and in my book, Family of Secrets, which has a lot about the Kennedy assassination, the real story of Lee Harvey Oswald and his own documented relationship with the FBI and the CIA was all covered up. And so when you know that there are other possible explanations. If we accept that Tamerlan Tsarnaev had a prior relationship with the FBI, and we know that now they are presumably in a car with another guy, we don't know what the actual relationship is. So maybe, I'm just saying, maybe, whatever was supposed to happen didn't happen. Maybe they were supposed to put a dummy bomb somewhere and something went wrong, and they were told now to just get out of New York, and that they were supposed to go in this guy's car. And, if these two brothers trusted him, which is the indication by the actual behavior of both brothers getting out of the car and one going in. But if he got out of the car and he ran across the street and the elder brother saw him run, and they had been told that they were supposed to somehow interact with this man, the elder brother would say, "What the heck is going on?" And he'd run to the brother and say, "Let's get out of here. Something is up."
Yeah, that actually makes sense. That actually makes, I never thought of it that way, but that actually does kind of make sense. I know it sounds like an elaborate story and it sounds pretty insane, but I think the fact that CIA...
But why would it be insane? Because if the FBI, let's go back to what we've already agreed on. The New York Times, and I'm going to fall back on them because people, trust them. They are one of the places that reported that 18 out of 22 of these kinds of incidents involved a central player who was working for the FBI. Okay, we have documented that the FBI knew and had a prior relationship with this family before the bombing. Okay, now we have them. The bombings go off. They buy milk and they go back home. Okay, so whether they knew a bomb was going to go off or not, they obviously didn't occur to them that they ought to flee or do anything else, and they didn't do that until the FBI put their pictures up. Now, when the FBI put up their pictures up, it might have occurred to them, "Oh my God, what is going on here?" It's like Lee Harvey Oswald. He said, "I'm a patsy." By all indications, Lee Harvey Oswald was doing exactly what the authorities was telling him to do, be a false defector to the Soviet Union, to do all these other other things. And if this sounds crazy to you, it means you're not very well informed, because there are hundreds of good books by professors and other experts who've looked into all this stuff. It's all known by those who've taken the time to study these things. And so it's known that the FBI does this kind of thing. It is known that the FBI had a prior relationship with these people. It is known that they did not act like terrorists. It is known that when their pictures were suddenly put up, they took off. Now, we do not know that they killed the MIT police officer. We can get into that. There's some real doubts as to whether they did. We do know that they probably were in a car with this Danny, but we don't know why. And here's another thing. How did they end up even being able to carjack him? The story is that he was just driving randomly on the same night that the FBI put out this alert, the same night that there was all this, tension in his town. He supposedly decided to drive in his brand new BMW, and again, how a graduate student happens to have a brand new BMW, just came from China. Okay, I'm sure there's many explanations, but a normal investigator would want to look into all this. Anyway, he's driving along. Supposedly, he decides to pull over to check some text messages. And he pulls over, and at that second, just by coincidence, the brothers happen to be following him, and they pull up behind him. Now, why were they following him? I mean, in that scenario, any fair-minded investigator would at least consider the possibility that they pulled over because they already knew him, and because they were supposed to pull over, and that they had been told that they were then supposed to get in his car. And one of them gets in his car, the other follows behind in the other car, which they eventually discard. But I mean, that all looks like people who are told to work together.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I agree with you. I mean, when I was saying it sounds like an elaborate story, I mean, for the occasional listener or the person who hasn't really looked into history, because anytime we talk about things, and usually it doesn't take long before some debunker or somebody wants to say, oh, I sound like a conspiracy theorist or something like that. I mean, there's plenty of historical evidence of real conspiracies, from us overthrowing the government in Chile, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Iran, and 53. I mean, there's the JFK assassination and all the things that you wrote in your book, Family of Secrets, which if people don't have it, please get it. It's a great book. And before you vote for a Clinton or Bush, maybe you should learn a little bit about their history and the history of the family. And so I highly recommend that. And I've had Abraham Bolden on, and I've had Rick Ross, who's a part of the drug smuggling and I've had Roger Stone, who we talked about the Clintons quite a bit too when he was on the show. So I mean, people who listen to the show, I mean, obviously there's not too much that seems unbelievable. I mean, it sounds kind of scary, when people say that reality's scarier than fiction. I think sometimes when you go deep into these rabbit holes, it kind of seems like that. And it definitely, it's hard to talk about these things often and not get a little bit, I guess, depressed about the future. But yeah, but to get back on topic. So also you look at just the history.
Well, let me just say something about that, being depressed about the future or the present or the past.
Yeah.
The reason people get depressed is because they feel unable to do anything. And, those who pay attention to these things and study them and learn about them are already doing something about it. And when you meet them, when you meet what they call amateur researchers, these people are generally seem like fairly animated, happy people, because at least they are confronting the darkness. Now, you said about reality being scarier than fiction. Of course it is. The people who read my book, Family of Secrets, the people who read our site, Who, What, Why, are the screenwriters for Hollywood. And they go out and they do these stories because the people who love to watch 24 or whatever they call all those fictional shows, probably some do so and believe that the reality is something like that, but a lot of them do it because it allows them to have a psychic relief to their fears on these fronts. And then when people like us actually investigate the real stuff, they can dismiss us as kooks. This is the lazy, guilty way out, because most of us don't do anything to strengthen our democracy. Most of us wouldn't even take a second to stop a looming, quasi-fascist state from coming when we can just, stuff our gourds or watch another football game. I mean, that's where we are, and it's very, very easy for people to label other people kooks or conspiracy nuts or something like that, and not actually do any homework to find out how things are and how they operate. But when you do, and if enough people started caring and paying attention to these things, these sort of crimes against the public could not be perpetrated so easily.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. When I say things like that, I'm kind of similar. I'm a pretty positive, happy person, always smiling, and a lot of times I do spend a lot of time researching and watching documentaries, and I guess I could call myself an amateur researcher, but it's one of those things where I feel this whole podcast, I mean, it's a perfect example, from your website, writing your book, being motivated to do that and put out, and obviously money isn't your motivation, because there's not a whole lot of money in putting out free content, and similar with my podcast, and that's why it was called it is called the Ripple Effect Podcast, because when I started, I truly believed that even if I could only make a little ripple, if I could only make a little bit of a difference, a little bit of an impact, it's still worth it. And sometimes you don't realize how that little ripple becomes something more and something bigger. And if we all believe that we can, create a little ripple, then it becomes a much bigger, effect and have a bigger effect on the people around us and the world around us. So I think that the worst thing we can do is assume we can't do anything and just go along with it. I think the best thing we can do is say that even if we can only make a little impact, is that at least, even if you do it for and like I say all the time, I do this podcast. Obviously, I don't make any money doing it. I have a full-time job. I have a son. This takes up a lot of my time and energy, but I love doing it because I truly believe in trying to leave the world a little better than I received it. And when you look at the future, people growing up now, kids, you want to hope that we can kind of make a difference in their mentality and their thinking, and just even if it's just planting the seed of questioning things and work on your critical thinking and just do that alone. I think we can kind of look back at our lives and say that, hey, you know what, at least I did the best I could, and I find fulfillment in that, and that's kind of where I am. And a couple years ago, not to get off topic and talk about my podcast, but I just think that I didn't come from anything. I was just a typical kid who came from full-time job, was a mediocre musician, and one day just thought about doing a podcast because people like yourself, your book, and a lot of people I've had on the show that just kind of blew my mind and really opened my eyes to the world around me, motivated me to want to do this podcast. And I felt like maybe I could, even if I could just get affect a couple people's perspectives, then it'd be worth doing. And a couple years later, I've had people like yourself on twice. I've had James Corbett on, Jesse Ventura. I've had tons of great guests that Dr. Brzezinski, people that I couldn't even imagine that I could sit down and actually have a conversation with. So I think the moral of that short story is that we can all make a difference, and even if you think you can't, attempting to, you'll be surprised how fulfilling that is, just knowing that you're waking up in the morning and you find a purpose, and you're trying your best to try to not just go along with the herd, but I guess change the perspective of the herd. So it's I think that people like yourself and this message of try to do something, and people who research this stuff, you don't necessarily do get depressed, because you really do feel like you're doing something, trying to share these ideas and opinions and looking into these investigations. So I can't thank you enough for your work. But yeah, so I lost my train of thought after that little rant.
Well, you wanted to, first of all, let me just say that, you and people like you are heroes, and you should feel very good about yourself. But I think you wanted to head into some more about the bombing itself. We were talking about the anomalies, about the carjacking story that doesn't make any sense, and I think you were wanting to shift to another piece of the story. I had mentioned also that the MIT shooting doesn't make any sense. I raised issues about the admission by the government that they knew these brothers prior, the fact that the government has routinely used these kinds of people to so-called infiltrate plots, although there's a very, very fine line between infiltrating plots and causing crimes to take place and then catching the perpetrators.
Yeah, and when we talked about, it seems like an elaborate story. I mean, like you talked about, the FBI has a history of these things. I mean, from the first attempt, I think, at the Twin Towers bombing to, I mean, just tons of, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember a lot of them, but you constantly hear stories about the FBI kind of putting somebody in the right place, giving them the tools to commit a crime, then arresting them and provoking the crime.
Yeah, and of course, some people will say, well, look, we'd rather that they find out who's criminally inclined than not. And I suppose you could make that argument. But then at some point when you would have to ask, if there had been no FBI person whose job was to sort of encourage people. And by the way, in these things, they really do encourage. I mean, where they're wearing a wire, you can hear them saying, "Oh, come on, what are you?" I mean, there was a case of these peaceful demonstrators, and there was an FBI infiltrator there, and he was encouraging them to violence, and they said no, and he kept pushing them and calling into question their manhood and so on, and they finally did something. And as I recall, I think they're serving, life sentences now. So, how is that okay? Because I mean, if that's the criteria, I think a lot of people are susceptible to pressure and to peer pressure. And if that's okay, then apply that to your own family. If your own kids get caught in something like that, and somebody pushes their buttons and gets them to do something, then you ought to be okay with them going to jail for life.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a journalist, when I just recently the Michael Hastings story kind of got, I guess, reignited by the fact that I think it was Wired who, I don't remember the exact details, but they basically hacked a Jeep Cherokee or some type of Jeep SUV and got it to turn off or got it to crash. And this, I guess, provokes the facts of the Michael Hastings stories and provokes conversation again with what happened and could that have happened? Could his vehicle been hijacked? What happened with that story? Now, as a journalist, is it something like the Michael Hastings story scare you with the fact that you could piss off the right people? And it's obviously not the first time that people in the media have been, I guess, shut up. They try to shut him down or shut him up, like the Gary Webb story and many others.
I suppose your listeners may already know who Michael Hastings is, but it's always my tendency to provide some background because I don't know that they do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael Hastings was a journalist, a reasonably young journalist who had scored a bunch of significant coups and in the process angered some very powerful people in the Pentagon and the CIA and so forth. And what happened was that a couple of years ago, he was working on a story that he said was very, very sensitive. He told friends that he thought that the FBI was investigating him. He indicated that he was doing a story about the head of the CIA. He said he had some amazing stuff and he was going to have to maybe even go, shall we say, underground for a bit. He also told his neighbor that he feared that somebody had been tampering with his car, and he begged her to let him use her car. Now, the next day, while driving along an empty Los Angeles street, his car suddenly went out of control, jumped the median and plunged into a tree, and then it exploded, and the engine flew out, depending on what account you read, somewhere between 50 and 150 feet. On whowhatwhy.org, we were the first, I believe, news organization to really ask any questions. We obtained footage from the pizza parlor across the way. We talked to experts about car crashes and car design and so on. And there were some very serious questions as to whether this could have been something other than an accident, given all the other things I just described to you. And yet the media, the police and the FBI and everybody rushed to say it was definitely an accident. Case was closed. Let me tell you something. When you close a case, whether it's that or the Boston bombing, without a investigation going on for weeks or months, you're not investigating.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. I think the Michael Hastings thing's really interesting because I think Mercedes wouldn't comment on how the motor ended up being, I forget how many feet away from the vehicle, and I don't know if anybody ever looked in, or if you looked into the cremation of his body. I know some people reported that they cremated his body before anybody gave him.
Yeah, that was a false story.
That was.
We debunked it. It was a person describing herself as a journalist who briefly got a flurry of attention on the internet, and she said some things that were not correct. Look, this stuff has to be handled by serious journalists who are professional and are not trying to whip up hysteria, but are trying to do a serious, open-minded job of investigating.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's why I love your work, and I love when you do these interviews, because you're not afraid to get into these stories that might be, what mainstream media might call fringe stories or whatnot. And you obviously are very credible. You've written for Vanity Fair, you've written for tons of different publications, and you're not one of those people that are conspiracy theorists. You're not an Alex Jones who's just connecting dots that aren't there and scaring the shit out of everybody. But I've always loved your work and Jesse Ventura's work, because you're people that just look at the facts and then just state them. And even if some people might call you conspiracy theorists or whatnot, you don't stray away from certain stories, because if something makes sense to you, you'll still go there.
Well, let me say something. Number one, nobody can call me a conspiracy theorist, and I don't allow that, and I reject that because it's just bullshit.
Yeah.
Because they're using that term as a pejorative to suggest that somebody is whacked out. There is nobody who read my book or has followed my work for 25 years who doesn't find my work to be serious, careful, and fully documented. So that's just bull. Number two, the term conspiracy theorist, anybody who deploys that should be looked into themselves, and I'll tell you why. If you go online and you Google conspiracy theorist, put it in quotes, and CIA memo, and I want to say 1967, there was a CIA memo talking about the importance of discouraging people from looking into the Kennedy assassination, asking questions, questioning whether the CIA may have known anything about it. And this memo was calling for pushing out to the CIA's, quote, media assets, this term conspiracy theorist or conspiracy theory as a way of demonizing those who ask questions. And so we have to fight back. We have been, kind of unwittingly, of course, brainwashed to these terms fill our heads. The intelligent discussion of real facts is shut down by this, kind of programming, essentially. And I wasn't going after you, but because you get this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the CIA purposely, like you said, they purposely attempted to use that term to discredit people. And I think, after JFK assassination and so I mean, and unfortunately, I think a lot of times when people use that term, it like you said, it is to discredit people. But there's plenty of, even if you do, and that's the thing, like, they don't really criticize the information you're giving. It's certain taboo stories. So it's like, even if I'm talking about the Boston bombing or Adam Lanza or James Holmes or any of those things, if I'm just questioning it, it has nothing to do with the actual conversation we're having and the facts or questions I might have. But it's just the fact that I'm even touching or questioning those stories. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, you must be a conspiracy theorist. And I do think that there is an issue with, after every single event, there's people who just jump to the opportunity to call it a false flag and do all these things. So, and then you get lumped into those people, and you're just like, oh, you're just one of those people who question absolutely everything. But, a lot of times, what will happen is that you pick one side or the other. Either a lot of people end up jumping to the conclusion that it's a false flag, or jumping to the conclusion that it wasn't, and anybody who thinks otherwise is just a conspiracy theorist. So,
well, let me say that the people who jump to conclusions that it is a plot and those who jump to conclusions that it isn't, they all deserve each other. They're all the same thing. Okay, and I would say that those radio shows and those things that whip people up into hysteria, often over false things, are either themselves disinformation agents, or they're as bad, they're just reckless people. And it really is a kind of a crime against the public interest to do that. So I would dismiss them, and I would dismiss the people who call other people conspiracy theorists. I dismiss all of them, because the only legitimate position to take and the only honorable position to take is to be agnostic, to be open-minded, and to be willing to look at facts.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think you're right. They're doing a disservice by jumping to those conclusions, because when you start connecting dots that aren't there, and you consistently start calling everything a conspiracy theory or a false flag event, then people are going to stop listening. And I think that's what ends up happening. There's so much of that just nonsense that people have to filter out, and people are just, I think it gets to a point where, like I said, it ends up making it harder for people who actually want to have honest conversations about these type of things, because you do end up bringing up these certain issues or these certain events, and people automatically will just categorize you that you're conspiracy theorists. And unfortunately that sometimes is the case. But I know just recently on your Who What Why website, you guys talked about Hiroshima, and one thing that I think is really interesting about history in general is that how, that old quote that history is written by the winners, and it certainly is true, because I remember watching the Untold History of the United States by Oliver Stone, and his just telling the story of Hiroshima, and then reading up on the fact that they didn't have to drop the bomb, and it was, I guess, officially they did it to win the war, but unofficially they did it as an experiment, and probably to send a message to the Russians. So is that do you think that that's what happened, and in your investigation into it, is that what you learned?
Well, I didn't investigate it. It's a website that I'm the editor-in-chief of, and I'm going to leave that to those who wrote the articles or did the podcasts for us, because they're the ones who looked into that.
What's your opinion on it?
Well, I mean, people always ask me, who's going to win the election with this and that. I always give the same answer, is that unless I personally looked into something, I don't really know any more about it than you do. You read those articles. The people who wrote them are respected, thoughtful people. Are they right? I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think if you talk to the editor of the New York Times or the Atlantic Monthly or anything, they would tell you the same thing, is that they try to make choices of writers and reporters and researchers who seem to do good work, and they let their work stand on its own.
But I think it goes to a bigger point, that one thing that's always been really interesting to me when I started this podcast and really started diving into historical events and stories more and more, is that how much influence people who write these stories and teach these stories, how much influence they have on the public's perception of past events and then current events and future events. Because like the Hiroshima thing, a lot of people do believe that they didn't have to drop the bomb, that they, it was because of Project Manhattan, they spent all this money on development, and it was really to send a message to the Russians afterwards, and Truman, no matter what, was going to drop the bomb. It's just one of those things where these other sides of these stories, these other perspectives of people just questioning it, a lot of times you don't run into this stuff unless you find work, your work like you did on the Bushes and Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, and so many other people who question our perspective, or Howard Zinn or whoever that questions one perspective of history. And I think it's kind of dangerous, the fact that you look back and it's like, if you don't accidentally run into some of these things like Who, What, Why or Family of Secrets, sometimes your ignorance might come, it might not be your own fault. It might just be of lack of being exposed to the right information, or at least information to question what you think you know. And
well, I mean, one of the great dangers is how, and I think this is what you're talking about, how we get our information and where it comes from. Because in our society, we have sort of intellectual elites, if you want to call it that, or certainly economic elites and so on. And those economic elites are very much targeted in order to shape their perceptions, because they're influential. They have an impact on other people. So it's important, let's say, to get the talking heads or on CNN all on the same page. Now, how do you do that? Well, where do they get their information? They read the New York Times. They read the Atlantic Monthly. They read a certain number of things. They watch Charlie Rose or whatever. So if Charlie Rose, where does he get his choice about his guests? Maybe he reads the Atlantic Monthly, And so this is how the process works. And paradoxically, I have found that some of the best educated, most successful people know the least about how things actually work. And it seems impossible that people in high-powered corporate law firms, people working at, who went to Harvard and work in the State Department and stuff, could know less than the rest of us. But my work, I've discovered that that's true, because the things you're talking about, Oliver Stone's history, they didn't read it. Okay, Howard Zinn, maybe they read him, maybe not. Did they take it seriously? I'm not sure. The stuff we're talking about, Boston Marathon bombing, they don't know anything about that, because they're all reading controlled media, essentially. And so it's this kind of a vicious loop, and it's garbage in, garbage out, and they do dominate our culture.
Yeah, they're all reading Atlas Shrugged and and not realizing that the Christians that are reading it are about, talking about capitalism and all this stuff are the same people who don't realize that Ayn Rand wasn't religious. But it's funny, because you do see conversations with people that are in high ranked positions, and I'm just amazed sometimes by just the lack of knowledge of history, or the lack of I don't know if it's on purpose or whatnot, but there's a podcast I listen to where they have some intellectuals on, and everyone, some of these people have huge influence on foreign policy and stuff like that. And it's amazing how they talk about how, oh yeah, we thought the Iraq war was a good idea, and this, and I'm like, these are the people who are influencing our decisions. I mean, these are the people who are making these decisions. I mean, I understand the average person who goes to a full-time job and doesn't have time to research or read, and then basically I guess their information that they consume daily is watching whatever the nightly news is right before they go to bed and pass out, and then do the whole routine again. But they have kids, they have priorities, all this stuff. So it's amazing the people who actually spend their time researching this stuff, how little they know sometimes, or at least how little they pretend they know, or how they. I mean, it's just amazing to me, because like you said, it is. To me, this alternative media sometimes has better information, better researched information than the mainstream media, and these, like you said, intellectuals, or people who are supposed to have well thought out ideas and opinions.
Well, if you think about it, there's a pattern here, which is that almost everything seems to be backwards.
Yeah, that's true. So somebody who's researched the Bush family, and also quite a bit about the history of the Bushes and the Clintons and stuff like that, what should a voter, if I'm just a typical voter, and I'm assuming that the final two are going to end up being a Clinton and a Bush, even though it looks like Donald Trump's getting some what's the word I'm looking for? He's getting traction. Yeah, he's getting some traction. Even though, have you heard this story about Clinton calling Trump before he ran, which kind of sounds like he's pulling a Ross Perot thing, where he thinks maybe, I guess, throwing a curveball in there might give the election to a Clinton?
I hadn't. Obviously, I think everybody's calculating what impact it will have for various people to be in or out of the race. So it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I heard that Bill called Trump right before he decided to run, and obviously Trump isn't putting all his eggs in one basket and saying he's running as a Republican. He's keeping it open that he might run as an independent, which a lot of people believe, or at least just looking at it historically, it could happen that it could turn into another Ross Perot, where he ends up, I guess, taking votes from the Republican Party, and a Democrat wins. But for the average voter, and do you think there's information, what's important information that people should know about these families before they actually vote accidentally for one of them?
I think anyone who's read my book, Family of Secrets, knows that I was astonished by what I learned that I didn't know. This is after the Bushes had been in the White House for 20 out of a 24-year period. What I didn't know about them, and what it turned out, I guess almost nobody knew except maybe the Bushes themselves, and it was enormous. And it was really stunning to see how much we miss about what's happening right in our time, right in front of us. And so I think we know very little about any of these people. And one of the real tragedies is that we do not understand the context in which this is all taking place. And so we look at the presidential election as if, I mean, do you think it's real that Mike Huckabee or Donald Trump could actually become the most powerful person in the world and more or less do whatever they say they want to do or are going to do? I mean, it's completely insane. This country is dominated by a military-industrial complex that basically never changes, by a bunch of corporations and a 1% of a 1% that really seem to own so much of our society. Do you think for a second that in any country it would really be permitted that any child could grow up to be president and do whatever wacky thing they say they're going to do? It would never be allowed. And this explains why Barack Obama pushes for the exact same so-called free trade agreements that disenfranchise workers and destroy environmental standards and so on that a Bush would. This explains why an Obama has troops and military invasions all over the world like a Bush did. The only difference was that Obama's interventions were described as quote-unquote good invasions because his base are liberals, and so liberals don't like wars, and so the Libya and Syria were presented as human rights issues, which they are not any more than there are human rights issues in a huge number of countries, many of them run by allies of the United States that we never complain about. So it's a very selective styling and media coverage of these things. Again, whowhatwhy.org, our site, we were alone in questioning the narrative about why the U.S. had to go in to remove and then kill Gaddafi, or why they had to go in and remove Assad. The talking heads that we listen to, these professors and so on that they put on TV, either they're totally clueless and have not read their history at all, or there's a fundamental corruption in our system, and I'm going to go for the latter, but some combination, where in order for them to keep their jobs, they have to go with this mythology of American exceptionalism, and everything needs to be blamed on other people. There's never any discussion of the battles over the natural resources in these countries and all the other things that go on, or of the corporate interests in this country and what they seek to gain by changing the leadership in these places. I mean, the fact that we don't discuss any of these things, I mean, shame on us, really, you know, and this is something that goes on again and again, and it just never seems to change. Although the good news is that, you know, you have a podcast, you have Beyond, we're talking about this, people are listening to this, and it's up to us to educate ourselves and to inform those know-it-alls with the Ivy League degrees who have it all wrong, what is really going on, and that's actually how you achieve change. Change can come from anywhere.
Yeah, and not just inform those people, because those people, their minds might not change, but what we're doing is we're influencing the future people who are going to have possibly an influence on government or policy or just what happens in the world. I truly believe in influencing kids and people younger than myself. Not that I'm that old, but it's just one of those things where I truly believe that when you're in your teens, when you're in your early 20s, just like we were at one time, and just trying to figure out ourselves in the world around us, you know, if we can connect with those people and we can help change their perspective before propaganda and brainwashing, you know, makes them a consuming zombie, you know, a producer consumer zombie. And if we can do that, then I think that goes a long way. So that's kind of, you know, our goal, and I'm glad that in 2015 we have the technology and the ability to connect with people I'm a fan of, like yourself, Russ, and to be able to have these conversations and put them out for free. And as long as they don't start regulating the internet, which is obviously a possibility too, as long as it's this free flowing thing where we can just post things online and have it uncensored, then hopefully we can keep provoking thought and get through to these younger people who are going to have a huge influence. Because like you said before, we can all make a difference, and I think the most dangerous thing is assuming that we can't. So But I know you're a very busy man, Russ. Thank you so much for being on again. I truly.
Well, sure. Let me just. Sorry.
Absolutely. Oh, no problem.
I just want to say, what you just stated was very well put. Totally agree with you. We're seeing tremendous interest from people who are 17, 18, 16, who are thinking for themselves. Very, very exciting. I agree with you that we need to reach out to our fellow citizens, but the point I was trying to make, by the way, was that actually even some of those people in the elites are not actually bad people. They're just I don't want to say brainwashed necessarily, but whatever they are, they give cognitive dissonance. They are part of the system. They do well, and they want to believe that they're part of something good. But even those people can be reached, and it's important to reach them as well. I think it's important to reach all people. We've got fans in the military and people who work for intelligence agencies who like and appreciate what we do. And I suspect the same about your podcast. And so it is a good time. And as you say, the technology is tremendous. And I salute you, and I salute what you do. And I'm happy to be invited on here. I very much appreciate the opportunity, and I hope we'll be able to do it again.
Awesome. Thanks, Russ. I thank you so much, because if it wasn't for people like yourself, then I wouldn't be here, because it really, and I'm not just saying this, I'm not just trying to blow smoke up your ass, but honestly, like, it's work like yourself and work that other great journalists and authors that have done, because I'm younger than you, and I grew up reading these books and watching these documentaries and hearing these podcasts and interviews that completely changed my life and completely changed my perspective on almost everything. And so if it wasn't for, I'm a perfect example of sometimes you're connecting with people that could do something that you don't even realize that you're influencing. So, it's no different than that teacher that probably gave you some good advice or had a conversation with you that stuck with you forever, but that teacher had no idea that conversation stuck with you forever. So I think sometimes we're making impacts that we don't even realize we're making. So, so thank you so much, Russ. We'll definitely have you on again. And everybody check out whowhatwhy.org. Get his book, Family of Secrets. You might want to read it before you vote for a Bush. And thanks again, Russ. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yep. Take care. Bye.